Thanks again for joining us today. I'm Michelle McLean with SALT Security, and I'm joined by Michael Nicosia, our co-founder and COO, and Joe Martinez, Chief Security Officer at Aon and a real dear friend to SALT Security. So, Joe, we're super excited to have this fireside chat with you, go through a few different topics and questions. And Michael, do you want to kick us off?
Yes, Michelle, thank you so much. And welcome. Joe, as always, great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us in our fireside chat. As we start the process, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about your background and Aon's background, just to kick us off.
Sure, Michael, and thank you for having me. Always great to have a conversation with such a good and dear partner of ours that actually help us really achieve some good successes. For me, just real quick, I'm the Chief Security Officer here at Aon, managing things all cyber and as well as risk management and physical security, so a little bit of a combined function. I've been here about 7 years, just this past October, and essentially really came from a long track record of managing sort of information security and cybersecurity throughout the financial services industry, a long couple of years at JPMorgan Chase, and then before that at Washington Mutual, and then before that I served a good dozen years or so and some change in the U.S. Marine Corps, that's where I actually learned cyber at the very end of my career. So that's how I sort of got into this gig as a whole. Aon specifically, our company is essentially in the business of risk management and helping other corporate clients understand their risks to manage those better and to potentially offset those risks to entities or bodies that are willing to bear it, aka insurance. So we help large corporates manage their errors and omissions, and directors and officers and facilities management and their health and wealth management, or anything related to maybe in terms of how you can manage risk within your organization. And that could be modeling out your workers' compensation for your employees. It could be understanding essentially how to protect your facilities globally, if you happen to be globally, or your supply chain. Understand how to participate in the ESG environment and how your company is going to contribute. So lots of aspects of our job, of our company really help. We're also a cyber company too, a security company. So for those of you in the know, we acquired Strauss Freeburg, the digital forensics firm, a few years back, and then they're in the practice of helping companies navigate this crazy landscape of ours here in cyber. But that's our story. Again, a wonderful job, have a beautiful team, globally deployed, but doing all the classic things almost any other CSO would be doing as well.
It's so interesting because your business is in the area of risk, and then that's so core to your job. It's like an interesting perspective you get to have. So obviously the security landscape changes all the time. And one thing that I'm really interested in is understanding how you approach that dynamic landscape as a CISO. You know, things shift, new threats emerge. So how do you end up sort of deciding the to-do list for your team? Like, what makes the list? How do you prioritize projects? And how do those things shift maybe even after you thought you had a list set for the year, for example?
No, this is a good starting question, Michelle. It's probably the main core sort of problem / opportunity that a lot of CSOs are working through to resolve, which is how do I make sense of all of the things that drive risks in our environment? How do I sort of either quantify that in a way that's relative to my business, right? And then how do I make the determination as to what investments I'm going to go after that can help address some of those key items that could be material to your company? So we do that sort of with a lens of risk appetite. We try to figure out, again, everything in this space. Our mantra basically when we're negotiating or talking with the business is it's always yes, but. The answer is yes, we want to do these things, but I would ask you to consider sort of these other key items around what the risk could be for that overall. But that starts with your first part of the question, which is, do we understand, do we have agreement, or do we have a level of understanding what are the things that drive risks in our environment, right? Whether it be operational risk, financial risk, in our space, security risks, what the threat picture looks like, keeping people aware and up to date in this ever-changing landscape. It used to be, I don't know, we had a seminal issue once a year to manage, and then it's like once a quarter, once a month, and now it's like once a week. there's something new that comes up that sort of like changes your calculus about like what you have to focus on, and it's really, really challenging. That being said, though, I will tell you though, in talking to a lot of other CISOs as well, a lot of the work that needs to be done is really transferable from company to company, right? The blocking and tackling that you have to do around understanding your environment, knowing all of it, detecting where the issues are, putting in the right set of controls that can prevent or mitigate it or contain it, whatever it may be, right? And then, of course, running at pace with the business and their growth agenda and their innovation agenda and their value creation agenda to make sure that you are not sort of coming afterwards and say, hey, wait for me, I have something I want to secure, like running with them to make sure that it's doing that at pace. So it's a challenge. There's no silver bullet. It's really, though, being like repetition is the highest form of flattery in our industry. You have to be constant in your advocacy about not spreading fear, but really being clear-eyed about the threats and the risks and the drivers, but then also having a plan about how you can manage and address that. Because you have finite resources, there's only so many people, there's only so many dollars, and you have to make choices. But you should be doing that with a really clear-eyed risk appetite, right? How much of this are we comfortable or uncomfortable with? And that ends up being your dispositive sort of landing spot in terms of where you invest and where you focus your work.
Awesome. And Joe, just in the same light, obviously prioritizing projects, just curious, I mean, how do you budget for new areas of risk? And I know at times it's in mid-cycle, so curious how you go about doing that.
Yeah, it's great because like you're a good example of how we sort of ran into that same sort of dynamic. So I can see where the question's coming from. Yes. Sometimes like you start at the beginning of the year and do your budget cycle, and like, okay, I'm going to work on these things. I think this is where the landscape is at, and here's the go-gets, right? Here's the things I want. Here's the outcomes I want to land on. And then all of a sudden, items change. Like for us, we had a big acquisition in the digital space, the digital landscape, in the B2C market. And then it sort of says, hey, wait a minute, we're now where we thought we were going to be somewhere later. We're now there sooner. And I need a capability that I sort of don't have. Right now, in that case, you can take advantage of some vehicles. Some of these opportunities present themselves. Like for us, we can incorporate that into the deal model and say, hey, why don't I instantiate something that I want to close on that I know is maybe net new for me, and then I use that as my springboard to do the rest of the enterprise, right? So some people have that flexibility. Sometimes you don't, right? Sometimes it just come on you, and you have to make do with what you have. Others, we use other vehicles, like if there's a big data center transition or a cloud transition, and then you try to peg some of the sort of the incremental improvements in posture tied to that if you hadn't forecasted in the beginning. Or sometimes you have to make a case for it. Right? Sometimes you have to make a case for it, write a business case that speaks to what you're trying to manage and then what level of investment it is. And then in our case, we always try to find a willing partner in the business. There's some businesses, sometimes, hey, like, why don't you go work with them first before you come to us, right? There's a little bit of that. Yeah. But some others are actually more open, like, hey, let's partner together as an overall. Like, for example, our UK business is always front of mind whenever we roll out new solutions, and they like to sponsor that. And to be frank with you, if we can make real what we're trying to do in that portion of it, it actually makes it really easy for the rest of the enterprise to say, hey, wait a minute, the UK did it, you can do it too, right? So there's lots of ways to sort of skin that cat. There's really no good answer, but my suggestion is like any which way you can. If you think the driver for the risk is material enough that you need to answer it, right? Or if not, you put it part of your long-term roadmap, right? You say, okay, well, let me capture that in the next budget cycle. But if you're in between and you know you have a need, you have to be really inventive about how you go after that.
Great. Thank you for sharing that, Joe. That's awesome. So maybe perhaps tell us a little bit about the Aon journey, with API security. How did you become aware of it, and how did you know that your existing security stacks could or could not do, what this new threat vector was all about? Yeah, no.
It's funny you ask because, like, for us, I don't know if anything's ever done in this space. So no one's ever done. I think everyone's on some portion of the journey map between just starting out to, hey, I'm halfway there, and And I think I'm kind of mature, and but I still have a bit to go, right? Everyone's always has somewhere to go in this journey as we transition a lot of our environment. Look, Aon in its predominant history was a holding company mostly, right? International company nonetheless, with lots of little legal entities and domiciles, and everyone sort of did a little bit of their own thing. And then years back, it turned into an operating company. And then now we started building global, commoditized, scalable solutions that a platform-based perspective versus an individual sort of technology stack perspective, right? Portfolios, managed portfolios versus sort of intermediate portfolios. So as you see that also then, of course, started a logical transition to move to cloud, right? A lot of on-premise and a lot of dedicated hosting was now moving first in terms of IaaS or infrastructure as a service predominantly, and then migrating to PaaS, and then now recently getting into SaaS services. And then in that progression, the requirement to have these things deeply interconnected, both either on-prem and in cloud or cloud to cloud, right, was becoming hot and heavy, right? There was a lot of need to interchange information sets across that technology landscape. And in doing so, the way you do that, obviously, of course, in the non-legacy way, is through APIs. And these endpoints were proliferating at a velocity that was like, hey, wait a minute, I think we're getting really deep into this. And then we needed to figure out, as the perimeter was sort of shifting from an enclave model with defined DMZ and a tech stack of N-tier, web app and DB, and that stovepipe sort of only talked to itself, maybe a few other things. Now everything's interconnected, right? And APIs are coming up everywhere. And then in that realm, that sort of was our flashpoint to say, hey, we need something here that can help us understand the landscape of all these connection points, as well as, you know, is it being built the way we believe it to be secure, right? There's one thing to write a standard. There's another thing to check if the standard is being actually applied, right? Yes, we have standards about how to develop APIs securely, but what is validating that it's actually being done that way for real in these environments? And we were in multiple clouds, right? We're in GCP, we're in AWS, we're in Azure, we're in Alibaba. We have lots of cloud environments, and we needed something that could tell the story across all those environments. And that was the core of the driver as to getting a solution for this space.
I'm guessing as you described that at the beginning, you probably didn't even know, I mean, you had a notion of this proliferation of APIs, but you probably didn't even have a handle on all the ones that were out there and running.
That's absolutely fair. No, I think one of the funny byproducts, or not funny byproducts, but I think one of the welcome byproducts was that while we were selfishly trying to get a handle over all of that estate, right, have a deep accountability and enumeration of all the endpoints and all the API interconnects, one of the other byproducts is that, well, the cloud engineering team, we had a central cloud engineering team, but also, you know, because we're in a lot of countries, we're in 120 plus countries, lots of different little people were doing lots of little different things, right, under either one big tenant or multiple tenants in cloud and the CSPs. And what we were saying, hey, wait a minute, you know what we could, this actually helps us, like, have a stronger accountability over what's out there just operationally, right? Not just so much for security, but just let the tech teams understand how big is the estate that is now being built, either sometimes through their known processes or sometimes outside of them in that respects, right? Because in some cases, like our business, sometimes we'll build a partnership or get into a third-party relationship, and then bam, there's an API being built somewhere to interconnect systems. So when you hear that, to Michelle, to your question, which is yes, we were serving a need to make sure that we can validate the security integrity of these interconnects, but also it helped the team also enumerate these out for operational accountability. Like, okay, now we know what's being built. Now we can manage this as a pipeline, right? And that's been one of the great benefits, I think, in talking and getting feedback from our team, is that, you know, while they were making the business case to also have an API manager platform, like an APM platform to be put in play, this helps validate for them that need, right? When we found these out there, they were able to build a stronger business case and say, hey, we need to have stronger governance and management over the pipeline of APIs, and we need a solution for that too. And here's the math, here's the quantitative metrics that show where we're at and why we have a need.
That makes Total sense. And we are surprised along with our customers at the scope, even when they think they're doing a good job on that governance, right? They put in a solution like ours that finds the other APIs that aren't necessarily in those systems. And it's anywhere from, 40% more to, I think our worst case was 800% more that they didn't even know about. Yeah. So yeah, it happens all the time. So quick question. You've talked a lot about like, the security is here to serve the business, the yes, but I love that phrase. When you're thinking about security, there's two hats that you have to wear. There's the technical angle, but then there's like, what does it mean to the business? Can you talk a little bit about, I think very quickly, because I think it's probably intuitive for most folks, but from an Aon perspective, business value of the APIs themselves, what do they help you do as a business? And then really interestingly, how did you talk to the business about the business value of API security as part of your justification internally?
No, makes sense. So I will tell you this. I think Aon maybe a little bit as predominantly a consulting firm, a risk consulting firm. Our intellectual property is in essence information or data, right? We get information from our clients. We distill that. We provide our insights. We give it back and provide them value. We take that information and we partner with our suppliers and our other partners in industry, or carriers and markets, underwriters, whatever it may be. And that information flow is pretty constant. The information flow is enabled through APIs, right? So essentially it's trying to make relative how our business does what they do. Hey, at the end of the day, we gather information, we parlay that information, we tell a strong story, we build a narrative, and we glean out insights. And then we put that back to the client for them to understand. But I said the mechanism, the vehicle to which we do that with, is through APIs nowadays. It's almost exclusively now through APIs. Everything that new, at least, being built, right? So the idea here is that, okay, so now you know how important it is that we manage this interchange of information in a way that meets our client expectations, because they're demanding that, hey, when I send you information, is that being protected? Are you taking care of it? Second, if it's being used within the company or being parlayed with a partner to deliver a combined service, right? Are you making sure that information as it flows to and fro also being done in a secure and standard way, in a compliant way? And really the only way sometimes to answer that is, in some cases, yes, you could do that manually, but scaling that is difficult. You tend to need a solution, right? You need a service and a solution that can help you understand where the landscape is at, good, bad, or indifferent. To your point, some portions of the business actually do it well, very well. And others modestly, and then the others are like, wait a minute, I think I need to help you. Like, I need to help you, and I need to identify these things overall, because it puts the business value outcome at risk, right? Which is, at the end of the day, you want to provide these insights back, right? The information flow needs to be critical. Now, for other businesses like manufacturing, retail, healthcare, whatever it may be, you have a product potentially that you're managing. But really, at the end of the day, it's still the same concept, is that the interconnects that are critical to the creation of business value is what you have to manage. And then being able to say, hey, I want to make sure that these that we're minimizing the risks in those deep connectivity points between different companies or even within the company, to make sure that we can really land on what you're trying to do as an outcome. And that was the way the conversation went at the end of the day. So again, a little bit easier for us because we are an information company. That is our IP. Others say, hey, wait a minute, I build widgets, right? How do I do that? You have to be able to show that I'm not sure. This is, and I think those of you that may be on the call may say argue. I got this from Jamie Dimon back in the day in JP Morgan Chase, and when he was articulating sort of like the position of the bank and its interplay with technology, right? For a long time, they considered themselves to be a bank that happened to use technology. And it wasn't until the change came in that says, hey, wait a minute, we're really a technology firm that happens to be in finance, right? Every company this day is a technology firm. And if you're not, it may be a really small business, but almost every company this day is a technology firm. And if you're a technology firm, every company this day is an API firm as well too, right? Because that's the only way technology is interconnected these days. So if you have that as your premise, that makes it a good conversation with the business to talk about, hey, how this is important to them.
Yeah, Joe, thank you for that. And we're in total agreement there, by the way. So interesting. I mean, sometimes we'll hear developers that write APIs say that they're responsible or they should be responsible for securing the APIs. But we recognize and we all know that the security team are usually on the hook for any problems, regardless of who wrote the code. So just out of curiosity, how do you manage to straddle that with an Aon? And to be a little bit clearer, how do you balance? Maybe you could just talk a little bit about this shift left approach versus the shield right runtime security in API security.
Yeah, for sure, it's an and not an or. And I think if you go into it right from the very beginning in the conversations that you're having with your developer community or your application community, I think that's a good start, right? Because if they see it as an or, I will tell you most likely you may lose the part of that seesaw that's more about functions and features and product, because that's what they're getting paid to do. And you have to manage that, right, for strong delivery. Versus compliance and security and risk management and a bunch of other things. So the first starting conversation that is an and. You got to do both. When teams are small, right? And honestly, sometimes even for the larger teams too as well. I think we've proven this model out more than a few times now, which is they may say, well, wait a minute, I think I actually do this okay. You don't have to worry. I am doing security from the start, right? I'm encoding this as part of my pipeline. I have DevSecOps, and the sec part is for us as equal as ops and dev. So in other words, that could be quite true, but you always need to validate, right? So as much as I would love to take everyone at face value and say, yep, hand on heart, I'm doing all the things you're asking me to, you have to validate, right? As proper oversight and governance, you have to ensure that the controls are effective for what you're accountable for. So at a minimum, all you're going to do is reinforce that position and say, hey, wait a minute, yeah, you actually are doing it the right way. And here, I can prove it, right? And we're not so much saying audit. A risk function, security function, or control function within technology should be making sure and reviewing themselves that they are meeting both the letter and intent of the standard. In most cases, I will tell you, though, in past experience now so far, is that when you get in there, even sometimes when the team perceives that they're doing it, when you pull the information back and you say, hey, wait a minute, let me show you where you're really at right now, it becomes a more of a balanced conversation. And then it really is, hey, we just didn't have those resources to spend that time, or these remediations. I had to go live, right? The release date was this, and GA was that, right? And then those aren't because of malintent. Like, I don't think anybody goes into it and say, well, let me build the most insecure platform possible. No one ever does that. It's just that it's a race condition, and there's limited resources, and there's only so much they can focus on. But once you make someone aware, then the idea is, how can I build something into it that doesn't drive crazy inefficiency in what they're doing, right? Because I think everyone probably on the call can attest to that, coming in post facto, once something's released into production, or coming in with a flag, waving your bolt-on security saying, hey, wait a minute, you can't go live until you do this. There's only a few times you can really do that, but you have to scale it. And the only way you scale it is by deeply embedding it in the very beginning of the process for them overall. So we have lots of tools. Salt is but one of many tools that we've incorporated in the pipeline, static analysis and web application scanning and syntax validation. There's a bunch of stuff, plugins for the IDEs. There's lots of things you can do that help empower the developer on that journey map in a way, and also make it so that it's also part of their experience, right? So like, if you're giving them tickets within Jira versus, hey, come to this platform to figure out how bad your stuff was, no one wants to really do that, right? So the more you can figure out how they do work and then inform them of what the work really is in total, and then let them balance that. And then, of course, my advice or my observations would be is that you still have to pick those things that are on a risk spectrum, what's really important. You can't fix everything, even though folks sometimes tend to believe you can. And you say, hey, look, I can't let you go production with any criticals or highs or severes, but everything else I need a plan for, right? Like maybe we'll talk about some mitigating control or some other item. Maybe we'll put a WAF in front and have a policy there that helps you temporarily while you fix this thing later. right? But have a bright line, and then that way it becomes a more of a known quotient. So they know, hey, wait a minute, we found this item, they're not going to let us go, so we have to fix it. Let's fix this, right? Okay, all right. Well, this thing here, yeah, it's an issue, but let me go ahead and add it to add it to the third quarter release, and we're going to address it there, right? Because it is important, but it isn't as important as exposing us materially to some vulnerability, whatever it may be. So that's the balance. Michael, again, no defined answer, but it's always a conversation. There's always a yes, but.
Yep. No, it totally makes sense, Joe. Thank you for that. So, in asking this next question, I mean, what do you think provides the most immediate value in API security that you can share?
Mm-hmm. So I will tell you, so we'll take you guys out of it. I think the ease of putting it in, sometimes these solutions, to your other question, if the recommendation from our team would have been, I need you to spend 6 months putting something into your environment that's going to tell you how bad your stuff is, that would have been a tough conversation, right? If it's hey, I need like 2 weeks. Just give me 2 weeks, and we can get something that doesn't have a lot of friction, right? Actually quite frictionless, to be frank with you, right? And give me visibility. And then once we have visibility, we're going to come back and sit with you, and we're going to have a conversation, right? Not sort of to like blame cast or whatever, but just an open-eyed, clear-eyed conversation around what we found. And the ease of being able to put that in play and tell that story is really what's valuable, right? Again, nothing against agents and nothing against other sort of items that are more friction-based technologies or solutions to put in play. I just will tell you that it eminently shortened our time to value for this specific solution when we were able to put it in a way that didn't cause us, 6 to 12 months of sort of, design and configuration and figuring out how it was going to be typed into the pipeline. And it was really like, hey, look, just give me 10 to 12 days. And then I'm going to come back and tell you a story. And then from there, then you can build upon that overall. I think that's been the best thing in that case. So like getting visibility is really the number one thing overall. Yes, you have to then, once you find things, you have to fix it and remediate it, right? But at the end of the day, you can't really have a conversation as to what you need to do unless you know what it is that you need to do it to. And I think that became our prime directive overall. Plus, like Michelle's question earlier, man, it helped us tremendously just figuring out where everything was, right? To her point, we were one of those numbers where we said, well, we think we have X. Well, wait a minute. We have a little bit more than X. So I think we have something we want to manage here. Surprise, surprise. And then why don't we put all this in the scope, right? Now the scoping becomes more concrete versus an estimate of where you think it is.
It's really interesting to hear those thoughts and the continuation of your yes, but idea. I've had some other CISOs describe, well, one in particular, the firm had become very enamored of shift left and thought like, well, this is the right answer. And the developers were like, oh, one more thing on me, right? And this one guy said to the CISO, like, if we want to do shift left, we could be in really good shape in like a year. But if we do runtime now, we're safe now, And he had this notion of like, do you want to protect your future self or do you want to protect your right now self? And I thought that was, yeah, it was an interesting perspective. So you talked a little bit about finding some things, and I love how you're talking about this objectively and like big picture, and anybody can take away some of these lessons and some of these action items that you're talking about. Selfishly, bringing the conversation a little bit to SALT, can you talk a little bit about what SALT has meant for Aon, how it's helped your team, what your team's excited about? We'll talk about some good stuff, and then we'll talk about some challenges. But let's start with maybe some good stuff.
No, it's been I'm bullish, 100% bullish. Usually there's a lot of cyber activity out there in terms of providers and solutions, vendors and the like. There's a lot. I think in the midst of this conversation, probably 2 cyber companies started up while we were talking. so there's a lot in the space. Yeah, if only, right. 2 might have been a slow week. It is Christmas. So the challenge there is like, well, how do I know what really works, what doesn't, right? Because to be honest with you, and the SALT team will probably like, close your ears. Most of the conversations between peer networking and we talk to each other a lot. So my encouragement would be is like when you're trying to figure out what's really working, what drives value, is talk to your peers and then get a sense as to what they went through, what they didn't went through. Why repeat mistakes and try to figure it out on your own? And we have a lot of conversations, CISO to CISO, right? Our network, there's a lot of us from our old finance days that are CISOs now in their own right. And we have a robust conversations about hey, something over here. I think you're going to like what you're seeing here. So that's the start of it, right? So get a good reference understanding. And if you don't, my encouragement is be unafraid in asking, right? You shouldn't be surprised that when you start talking shop with other folks, people love to tell you about what things have worked, and they'll try almost equally love to tell you things that didn't work, right? So you'll get that list. Second, what's been good for us is that we knew that we had opportunities in our cloud environment that we had to manage quickly because the business was running at marathon pace, and we were sort of like doing a jog around the lake. Right. And so like, okay, wait a minute, we got to run at marathon pace, and we needed solutions that can help do that. And Salt is a good example of that overall. Again, I'm not saying it's trivial to put in play, but it's compared to like if you ever done DLP or you've done firewalls, you've done anything else, it's trivial from that lens of an implementation, right? For endpoint security. But it's still work to be done. But once you have it in, I think they love the ability to have a sort of a balanced conversation, right? It's not security going to the tech team or the app team, with a lot of presumptions about how bad something may be, or, hey, I need you to prioritize this, and it's an emotive conversation. This was more of a data-driven one. Hey, I just want to show you what we have, right? I think that's been really, really valuable because it helps then tell the story in other places too, right? Because it isn't just about APIs. You're going to have a very similar sort of engagement. Like we did a lot of things on our cloud security posture management, right? And then we did a very similar thing around CASB, right? And all these other sort of areas that we knew we needed to get into. And that whole thing of put something in that's frictionless, tell a really quick story about it, and then build a plan, right? I think that's been the benefit. And then you guys have fit that mold for us, along with a bunch of other key partners in that space. Of a very similar mind, but focused specifically on a space that we knew we needed to run API security. So that's been the valuable conversation. I think it's been really powerful for us overall. The team has been, it's high. They received it, both the security team and the app teams, which is rare because sometimes someone's always angry in that combination, right? Someone either doesn't get what they want or they're being forced to put something in that they don't want. But in this case here, both of the teams actually have good things to say about the platform as a whole.
That's really interesting. I liked how you talked about having kind of a workflow. Like, here's got to deal with this now. Here's the stuff we can do later. That makes it so much more workable and doable because, that backlog of, would you please go fix this? That's a very long list.
It is.
Okay, so thank you for sharing kind of the upside, but I think it's always helpful for audiences like we have today to hear the downsides too. Let's talk about some of the tough stuff. What was hard in this project? What problems came up that you found yourself needing to deal with or mitigate? I'd love to hear that.
No, for sure. Look, I think, and it's almost not even the inverse. It's basically the same thing. That's the benefit is also the issue to manage. Because one is, once you know how much you have to manage, now you have to manage it, right? You can't unsee things. You can't unsee something, right? So you can be ignorant, you can be blissfully unaware, right? You can think in your mind that no, I know we're here, don't worry about it, right? But then once you know, and then once you do, you have to manage it, right? Because otherwise, then there's other connotations if you don't. And I think for us here, that became the struggle because while the team was happy that we were having more balanced conversations that were data-driven, right? It wasn't argumentative. We weren't saying, well, I think you're here. And they're like, no, we're not here. I don't know where you're getting your data from, right? We were all using the same platform to tell the same story. But then that sort of had a knock-on set of effects, which is, okay, well, wait a minute. I don't think I have enough resources right now. Like I'm barely holding water, just getting code out. Right, or getting something for a major release window. I may not have enough people power to go through this. Or hey, you may expose that your process is a little bit inefficient about how you manage that. And then now you have to address sort of either technology processes or business processes that may have to change and account for it. Or maybe your app dev and app maintenance is done by a third party. You may have to revisit the contract to make sure that maybe some of these things weren't called out in the original stipulation of what you needed to do or what you needed a third party to do on your behalf. So there's a lot of knock-on effects that once you find the issues are what they are. They have to be managed. The question is, how do you manage that for capacity and velocity on the team that could be already strained, right? Unless you're working on a team that is, you're saying, hey, look, yeah, I have more than enough capacity to do all the things you're asking me to. I don't think anyone says that. No one. I don't think anyone's volunteer. If you do, let me know. I need some engineers on our side. We can hire them. But for the most part, almost everyone is constrained. But then now you're adding something that to be made aware. Like for us, for sure, to your point earlier, Michelle, we found a little bit more APIs than we thought we had. So then now we said, oh, wait a minute. Now the way that these things are instantiated, we need to fix that, right? Because we're missing a portion of the estate that's popping up, but it isn't being governed and managed, and we want to manage it, right? And then that could be something that you may have to stand up, right? That it hadn't been stood up before. So these are problems not so much with the platform per se. They're actually, to be honest with you, not many outside of features and functions that you want to see that I think Michael and team have been really, really great with us to work with us on sort of like our feedback as to how we can have the platform grow to maybe, for more enterprise type wide needs. But I think that's a logical journey that almost every company goes through, right? It's not that we're not having systemic issues with the core capability of the platform working the way it's supposed to. It does what it says it does. It's the output of it. It's really what you may not anticipate fully how you have to manage that output.
Okay, that's fair. That makes a lot of sense. We've had a couple of good questions from the audience, so I'd like to bring them into the fold. And if you have other thoughts running through your heads, guys, please pop them into the Q&A tile. We'd love to hear them. So you had talked earlier about prioritization and adjusting prioritization, and this person says, my colleagues think that API attacks are rare and they're kind of hard to do. How can I explain that this is something that's happening today? Hackers are doing this today, and we should be taking this seriously. Did you encounter any of that? Of like, is this really a big deal?
Yeah, no, that's fair. That's actually fair. Like if you're looking at the ramp of like 300+% increase in ransomware, and then most of those are not really done over APIs for the most part, or even predominantly. Most of that is either through phishing or through some directed attack on the web server or whatever maybe that's exposed. You can say, hey, wait a minute, like I see in the landscape, I don't know if the risk is commensurate with other areas of key risks that we want to focus on. I will tell you, like when you go finding and you go detecting where your APIs are actually at, if you're managing data either on behalf of a client or for your own company, now you sort of have a little bit of an obligation to make sure that, am I doing that through this whole life cycle? And that means as it traverses in and out, right? Especially if you do business as a global company like we do, you have hard requirements of how information is transferred in and out of a domicile, right? And it has to be secure. And you have to hand on heart say, yep, I have a lot of APIs and I can transfer the information securely, and I'm doing that. I will tell you though, a lot what you find is very similar to like the vulnerability problem with servers and websites, which is that sometimes it's not so much the esoteric attack that you should be worried about. It's more about sometimes misconfiguration. Sometimes it's also about just like configuration compliance, where you can have secrets in the kernel. You can have a lot of things that are being exposed, PII that's exposed in an API that you're not supposed to, right? And or endpoints maybe going to places where maybe you're not actually entirely sure of. Was that like a secure endpoint on the other end of the chain? So like, it's not so much about hackers trying to build some novel sort of attack vector with APIs that they're concerned about. It's really that it's the pace and change of what's being brought out, and making sure that at a minimum that the APIs are being done securely from end to end. And if you put a tool like this in, you again, my mom is like, try not to be surprised about being surprised, but you shouldn't be surprised that you're going to find a lot of configuration issues that isn't being done, that has nothing to do with the esoteric attack model, but it has a lot to do with like making sure that the team knows, because they're changing tech so fast that by happenstance, sometimes when you think it's secure, it doesn't stay that way, right? And will pose a problem for sure. I think you'll see a lot of that, to be frank with you.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. The other angle I've heard before that's pretty interesting in this dimension, it's a small echo of what you're saying. You'll hear about a breach, and it'll turn out the API worked as designed. They just never anticipated that somebody would abuse it like that, right? That they would like, oh, you found some way to like play a trick with this and pull way more than you were supposed to play, but the API worked as designed. And then companies get sensitive, like, well, that's not really a breach. Okay, but like a whole bunch of data just got stolen under your watch. So that still means something, right? So I think that's really interesting. And then there's another question in here about, we touched on this really briefly at the beginning. I think Michael had asked you, how did you know, or when did you realize maybe that the existing stack wasn't quite enough for API attacks? So there's a question in here about, you know, you've talked about mediating and governing APIs, you know, gateway vendors, WAF vendors, they'll talk about API security, but if they're not really effective at protecting against API attacks, then are those solutions kind of becoming obsolete? How do you think about the whole ecosystem of stuff around APIs and WAFs and all of that?
Remember, I mean, I don't think the defense in depth model has gone away, so that's still relevant to this day. I don't think and there's also one solution isn't comprehensive enough to cover all the landscape and all the risk vectors and threat vectors that you have to manage. You need a combination of things. Like our cloud security portfolio is at least 5 to 6 discrete solutions and a bunch of other things internal that compromise the portfolio that we use in SALT is part of that, one of the marquee items in our portfolio, but one of many in that portfolio. Because again, yes, if you're an F5 shop or you go to Cloudflare or you use native WAF services in AWS, whatever it may be, you can do that. Sometimes it also depends on the question of scale, right? If you can manage those things bespoke and locally and make them highly effective, my encouragement would be, of course, do that. But when you start figuring out that you have a lot of endpoints, a lot of workloads, and a lot of interconnects, and then you have lots of different cloud environments, not one, you need something that can scale with you, and again, runs at pace, right? You can have all these other solutions, but if you're building WAF policies in an old school Barracuda, whatever it may be, you could be adding friction to the pipeline of people doing that. You still can get to the same result, but it may not be as efficient as having something that's actually deeply embedded into the DevSecOps pipeline that can help deliver those same outcomes as well too. So it's really a question about where you think your dollars are best invested in, and if you could only do these sort of bespoke, not manual, but sort of like other items that are not as much turnkey, and that's how you can affect security, then my encouragement would be do that. But sooner or later, you're going to find that like the API economy right now is outstripping almost any other thing related to data flows in our environment, right? Every new application has not one, has several, right? And then now we're getting into the business of building broking systems, API broking systems that can help manage the craziness of all the APIs going everywhere as well too. So now we're building solutions specifically just for API management, right? Versus just thinking about how do I secure an API on one app or two apps. Now I have them all over the place, and now APIs on themselves are a technology resource that we have to manage, akin to managing a server or akin to managing a workload or whatever it may be, or a database, right? If you consider APIs that way, then you sort of almost land into your answer, which is, okay, well, now I need a focused competency around API management, API security, similar like I do with database management, database security.
That's just absolutely a perfect place to wrap. I think we don't have more questions from the audience, and that was profound. That was really interesting. I want to thank you again, Joe, Michael, for a great conversation. I really appreciate all the learnings that you've shared, Joe. People really like to see it up close and personal, and you were honest about what was easy and what was hard. I think that's super helpful. So quick reminder to the audience, feel free to check out the resources in the related content tile. And of course, if you are considering an API security project for 2023, which it's increasingly feeling like 2023 is going to be the year of API security, we'd certainly appreciate the chance to share our platform in action. You'll get a link to the recording of this, share it with colleagues. And we know you're all busy, so thanks for spending part of your day with us. And Joe, Michael, amazing session. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Michael. Really appreciate it. And if anyone has questions, by all means, happy to help support the industry. All helping each other helps us all, so the rising tide lifts all boats kind of approach, right? So, but thank you for the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Joe. Really appreciate it. Always great to see you, and thanks to the audience for listening in and tuning in. Appreciate it.
Yep. All right. Have a good holidays.
Happy holidays.
Thanks.